Y'all know what it is.
Hey there, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Eggs. Joining us today is return guest Jonathon Hensley. Jonathon is co-founder and CEO of Emerge Interactive and author of the new book, Alignment: Overcoming Internal Sabotage and Digital Product Failure. For more than 2 decades, Jonathon has helped startups, Fortune 100 brands, technology leaders, large regional health networks, nonprofit organizations, and more transform their businesses by turning strategy, user needs, and new technologies into valuable digital products and services. His work focuses on helping leaders define the value they want to create in a succinct and tangible way, where to focus, why, and what it will take to achieve that outcome. Jonathon writes and speaks about his experiences and insights from his career and regularly hosts in-depth interviews with business leaders and industry insiders. Here to talk about all that, the new book, and so much more, please welcome our guest, Jonathon Hensley. Hey, Jonathon, how are you, man?
I'm doing great, Ryan. How are you?
So good. Glad to have you back. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
It's actually pretty cool. You're the first guest we've had that's been on twice. So congratulations on that.
I'm honored, guys. Thank you.
The guest's so nice. You came on twice. Yeah, no, it'll for sure be one of the categories in our annual Eggie Awards this year. Will be the guest who came on the most times. So far, you're the winner. It's a big one. Oh, cool. Well, I guess for people who maybe didn't catch the first time around, do you mind just kind of breaking down quickly who you are and why we're talking?
Sure. So my name is Jonathon Hensley, and I've been running a product agency called Emerge for the last 22 years, where we help product leaders by empowering them to support their efforts in developing product strategy, defining their products, connecting with their customers, and then delivering those products and bringing them to market. And also really helping them elevate how they can build teams that are focused on high performance and delivery. And so that work over the last 20 plus years has really been my focus. And distilling all that down and some amazing perspective from people has been the culmination of the book.
Yeah. Speaking of books, this is why you're on a second time. You recently wrote a book called Alignment. And we were talking a little bit beforehand about the process of writing the book. And I thought, with COVID, how it kind of changed things for you there a little bit. That might actually be a good little story to tell about the process of writing that book. Can you tell us about how you wrote it, how long it took, and maybe some hurdles you had to overcome to get it out?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. So it's funny how the process started. It was a little bit over 2 years ago now when the idea really came to fruition. We're like, okay, I'm gonna commit to writing a book. I'd had people asking me to, or mentioning that I should probably write a book for a few years, kind of nudging me and saying, hey, we think there's some value here. But I finally, jumped over that hurdle, and I started with a little bit of a different idea. I started with this idea of writing a book called Friction at the time, which is all about the friction in a user experience and that businesses go through and how to address those pain points. And so I started interviewing product leaders all over the world in product teams. So designers and interaction designers, engineers, product managers, and leaders and executives. And what happened is the book itself went through its own realignment. We were about 100 pages into the book, and I looked at all of these amazing transcripts and insights from all of these people. And I said, there's a bigger story we have to tell here. There's something more important than this idea of friction. And so we pivoted in that moment. Luckily, there was a lot we could still use, but we realized that there was this key theme that all of these great leaders and design thinkers were focused on, and it was alignment. And they were the ones that were continuously able to find success, not just in their career, but with the organizations that they were helping build and lead. And so that really became the focus of the book as we made that transition. And then it took about another year and a half before the book actually came to market itself because of COVID and just the learning curve of writing and creating that story and making sure we represented all the key parts that came through that process.
Yeah, I love that. I think, and that's really I think most important thing about this book. I mean, and obviously there are a lot of books written on leadership and technology and how to develop digital products, things like that. But what's really great about this book is that focus on leadership, I think, because I think that this idea that alignment can just happen from a bunch of disparate angles, probably is much more difficult than the idea of having a leader start in with sort of a mindset that's made to be aligned, or, that is good at coaching people and bringing people into focus. So I think that's great. And I love that story. So let's, I guess, start getting into the book a little bit. So let's start off by sort of defining alignment as you see it. So, I mean, I think most of us probably have some idea we can put together, but how does it, how do you define it in the space of product development?
So in the space of product development, we're really looking at 4 levels of alignment. So the first one is around individual alignment, which basically boils down to everyone on the team understanding how their work matters, how their contribution and their unique point of view, their skills, their expertise really make an impact. And so that's really critical, because if people understand the role that they play, you're empowering them to make better decisions, work more effectively, and essentially make a bigger contribution to the team, the organization as a whole. The second part is team alignment, which really deals with building alignment and integrating different people with unique disciplines and experiences and perspectives. It's that co-creation that takes place. A good analogy that one of my friends uses is this idea of it's like bringing a band together, right? You've got to get that band where you have your drummer and the singer and the, all the different people and all the different instruments that are being played to create a beautiful composition. That whole idea is the same in product. It's no different. It's how do you build that, harmony within, the team environment and focus on that alignment. The third is the organizational alignment, which really deals with how do you build, something that is adding to the larger vision of the organization, fulfilling that mission, living up to the values of that organization, and is making a significant push forward based on the amount of resources that you have. And then the last is market alignment, really dealing with understanding your customer and their maybe unarticulated or articulated needs, and how can you solve a problem and really create value in their life, and what does that need, what does your product need to deliver in order to fulfill that?
One of the things that's coming to mind as you're talking is that old Simon Sinek thing that, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And that's making me think, specifically, or I guess it would have first occurred to me, in the individual alignment component, right? I mean, obviously, to use your band metaphor, people need to sort of, if they're coming into your band, it's because they believe in your band's mission, right? We love hard rocking. We love, whatever it is. But, but I think it's the same in an organization, right? They need to come in and they need to understand why we're doing what we're doing, as much as, yeah, you're going to pay me to do this, but, they should be able to align with why. But as you were going through each of those categories, it just kept, ringing in my head, this idea of why, right? Even all the way up to the organizational level or even the market level, people need to understand why you're doing what you're doing. And so I wonder if you couldn't maybe talk about that concept for a minute, sort of how do we communicate this why to people at each of these different levels?
Absolutely. So I think this really comes down to the foundation of strategy. I mean, what makes up good strategy? And a lot of times there's a lot of misunderstanding of what strategy is. I mean, there's a whole genre of books and articles and, people talking about what strategy is. But I think maybe what's really helpful, is to talk about what strategy isn't and what it's usually mistaken for, which would be things like setting goals or planning, being ambitious, grit, working hard. There's all these misconceptions that these things are part of strategy, and they are empowered by good strategy. But the reality is goals is not strategy. It doesn't provide a team with that clarity so they can understand how their contribution matters, how it fits into the organization, and what that team is there to accomplish. And so leaders really have to, go deeper into making sure that they are experts in the problem that they're solving and living in the shoes of their customers, and making sure that that information, why that problem is important, why that problem, has an impact on people and why it's important, and that, this team solves that problem, and the belief that it can be solved better than anybody else, for a particular group of customers or audience, then that clarity becomes incredibly empowering. It gets to the purpose of the essence of what that product or service is all about. And when you're empowering a team and individuals within that team, they need to have that clarity, and leadership has to take responsibility for making sure the work is done to get there.
Well, and one thing I saw in your book that I thought was kind of interesting too was how even at a biological level, this concept of alignment is really critical. And so, we're talking about these why problems, like we already have a problem we're trying to solve. But can you talk a little bit about just sort of our biological need for alignment too?
Absolutely. So one of the people that was involved in the project for the book is a neuroscientist by the name of Dan Cable. And he wrote a fantastic book called Alive at Work, all about empowering employees and employee engagement. And through, his research and his work, he really found out that alignment is not just this kind of psychological need in a lot of ways that it is talked about, but there's actually a biological component. And what it ties into is this idea of cause and effect. We are built as human beings to want to understand what the causes and effects of our actions are within our environment in the world. And so there's this innate need, and there's actually a response that happens when we see a trigger of that. It increases dopamine, and creates and unlocks all of these things that are happening inside your body that allow you to be more creative, innovative, and to find connections between things that may not be obvious. And so Dan really pushed this idea, in finding out that through his work and his research, it was super clear that there is this biological component that is so critical to the concept of alignment.
Like that.
Yeah. No, I love it. Well, and I think it's really important just to even think about it in that sort of historical context or this evolutionary context, just because it really helps us understand that when we're not working towards alignment, or we're, actively working against it, or we're doing some sort of form of leadership that isn't sort of, I guess, feeding into this, biological need, that we could actually be setting ourselves back.
Yeah. Can you actually maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that you can recognize that maybe your team isn't aligned, as like in a car, for example, if your alignment's off, it's pretty obvious, and you take it in and the mechanic rotates the tires and does everything you need. But in a team, a group of employees, and even with your clients, it's not so obvious sometimes. Can you maybe break down the signs of misalignment?
Absolutely. So I think one of the simple things, and also kind of talking about the biological component, just to kind of bridge the two, you see a lot of this issue of, why me, where there's a very self-focused, angle that an individual or team has. And you'll see that kind of fragmentation where ego is more important, or positioning is more important than actual impact and outcome. And that's a really easy thing to, identify if you spend a little bit of time with the team and, really starting to dig into, what is going on. Is this an ego-driven process, or is it, and are they in love with the idea, or are they actually solving real problems? And so that starts to become an interesting parallel when you look at it, how effective is a team as well, because people come together naturally to build community and to solve problems, to do something that has a amplification effect. And that's why we, come together as human beings. Other more specific things that are very easy to identify early on is, I love to use this little litmus test, and I'll go around to different stakeholders in a project or across a company, and I'll ask them, can you tell me what the purpose of this product is? And usually if I go to 10 different stakeholders, I'll get 10 different answers. So, and it's because they're coming from their vantage point, right? Maybe where they sit in the organization, their perception, or maybe how much control they have over that product or service that's being, developed and put into the market. And you can quickly start to see fragments of misalignment early on. asking them similar questions to, like, what's the problem the product solves? What's the impact of that problem on the customer? Who is that core customer? What's the near-term outcome that we're trying to achieve as this product moves forward, and how are you going to measure that progress? These are all foundational, pieces that, product leaders need to be able to answer and have clarity on. And if they don't, that's usually a sign that there's either misalignment or they're in the early stages of developing that product or concept, and that's the work that they need to do going forward.
Yeah,
you can see it with mature companies.
Yeah, you just landed on a key term, that idea of clarity. And we talked about it a little bit in the frame of alignment and actually getting aligned, this, communication with clarity. Looking at some of the root causes of the misalignment that you cite in the book, one of them in particular is not knowing our customers. And it's funny how many clients I come across, so I run a marketing company, and our clients with some regularity very rarely know who they're marketing to. And, like you said, each stakeholder is going to have their own take or whatever. And that seems like a breakdown in this communication of clarity, or even all the way back to our discussion of why, right? Absolutely. And so I wonder if you could talk about, that individual root cause, this idea of not knowing our customer, and how do we find out who our customer is if we don't know?
Yeah, I think, so it starts, I think, with a couple of key things. One is you have to be able to develop empathy with your customer. So if you're going to start to really focus on, there's a couple of key things that, you might start with. Lots of times you'll say, like, oh, I'm going to start with this industry or this type of demographic that I want to focus on. But that's the basics. That's just a starting point. And I think to really answer the question, you really have to look at what market does my product or service provide the most value in. So, and is that the size and the spending power in that market big enough to warrant me building a company or continuing to build and support a product for? Is that market identifiable? Meaning, can I actually get access to those people to sell the product, to have conversations with, and are they accessible in a way where I can, reach out to them in some way? Are they part of my initial network? Are there other networks or services that I can, engage with, and channels? And then, do they have similar behaviors? Meaning, out of that market that I'm focusing on, do they have a similar buying process? Are they going through trying to solve the problem that our product solves in a similar way? And those become a foundational element, because once you understand that and you can narrow in, you can start to do things where you can really understand what's the ultimate goal. How do I support this organization, this type of core customer, moving through the entire buyer's journey in getting access to my product or service? And that's where you start to see, when companies get to that level of clarity, they're able to have very targeted, very specific messaging where they're really resonating and connecting with a core customer, and they see revenues exponentially start to increase.
I like that.
Yeah, I love that.
We covered how to tell if your team is aligned or if there's misalignment issues. Can you maybe break down how you would go about working with the team to get them back on track? So if the train falls off the track, how do you get it back on?
I think, it starts with, Mike, what Ryan was saying about purpose, and, Simon Sinek's thing of starting with why. We have to get everybody aligned on what is the actual shared vision and purpose of the product or service that's being created. And so we start there, because every single person of every single function of the organization is there to help deliver the products and services of the company. So that allows us to start to work across all functions and really make sure that there's clarity from the beginning. From there, we'll start to look at the problem that they're trying to solve and look at, do they actually understand the problem enough? Have they gone deep enough to really diagnose the problem and get clarity on that core customer that they're there to serve? And if they have multiple audiences, how are they prioritizing those audiences? And at what stage do those audiences become involved in their product or service? And so once we have that kind of understanding, we can start to quickly build alignment, and you start to build up a data-driven structure for making decisions going forward.
I like that.
And we can get teams back on track. Absolutely. Because once you have that foundation, we can go, well, there's maybe 10 ways we could approach solving this problem, but if which one actually moves us forward to accomplishing our vision for the product? And does that actually solve the problem in a scalable and sustainable way that's relevant to our core target market? And so once we have those kinds of that kind of clarity and that shared understanding across a team, you're able to start to make more effective decisions. And I think what great strategy is, it tells you what to not to focus on, just as much as what you need to do. So it's really peeling away all the noise that's getting in the way of your team being able to focus on the right things at the right time.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing you talk, because as you're describing each of these components, there seems to be like this, check back kind of mentality where you're always checking and reassessing and comparing all these things. And I guess in this case, you're going back to the strategy, right? So you're going back and you're making sure that the action that you just took aligns with the strategy. And you're doing that at each step along the way. I think that's really a great practice. There's a quote in your book, just as we're talking about misalignment, there's a quote in here that says, people have confirmation bias. They look at things to confirm their beliefs, but don't look for what's causing problems or seek insight. That's from Indy Young. She's a founding partner. He's a founding partner at Adaptive Path. What I think is really interesting about that, and maybe it's more of a leadership question, is how do we bring people around on that? Obviously there are going to be some people who, this is a very human way of acting, right? This is back to biological causes. This is us trying to fight nature, right? We're trying to move people from this confirmation bias type mentality to something where they can, go into things with open eyes. And I think sometimes, or many times, that'll start at the leadership level. So I wondered if you had any idea about, or any, thoughts on how we might sort of impart that type of mentality to our people who maybe don't come by that naturally.
Well, I think there's two major components to that. One is leaders need to shift from this idea of a command and control approach where I'm the leader, follow me because I told you to, and recognize that you really have to be in a servant leadership mentality. You have to be flipping there. You are there as a leader to empower your team to do their work, to unlock their full potential, their creativity, and their ability to solve a problem. That is the absolute role of great product leaders and organizational leaders. They understand people are not there to serve them. Leadership is there to serve them. So that has to be a starting point. If you can make that mental shift, you've already started to act and look at situations from an empathetic point of view. And leaders do have a challenge where they're asked to make big decisions quickly, usually with not a lot of information. And so it's important that there is an open space to make sure that they have all of the available information without that bias as possible so they can make the best decisions possible and support the team. The second tool, though, is that all leaders can leverage is building a deep understanding and a practice of empathy. So, we use empathy mapping from a design perspective to help leaders shift their mentality from what they believe the customer, to be and what the customer needs to shifting them into the shoes of the customer. And it's amazing when you take a leader and you show them this is what your customer success team is hearing, and this is the customer's goals and their needs. And the CEO saying, I didn't know that. They had this perception. And the bigger the organization, typically the further removed leadership is from the customer. So the people that make your business what it is today, you're getting further and further and further removed from. So that practice of empathy and closing that gap becomes absolutely mission critical.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting how often now we hear about people talking about shaking this command and control mentality, but it's also incredible how many people still employ it, right? There's sort of this power struggle, I think, that takes place in an organization where, in a lot of cases, leaders feel like they must come in and lead. And that means in order to lead, they need to be on top of the soapbox and directing people, like they're Patton in the war, and, but I think the reality is exactly what you're describing. It's this idea that, you've brought in, and hopefully through good hiring practices and everything else, you've brought in the right people for the job. Now it's your job just to kind of help them along, help them solve their problems. If they arrive at a situation, your leadership role then is to help them overcome this hurdle versus, tell them what hurdle to go jump. And so I think that that's a really great idea or a great way of talking about it.
You're hitting on some other really key things. When in that control mentality, and the patent analogy is a perfect one. The funny thing is, when you look at special operations in the military, Simon Sinek talks about this too, about how leaders eat last. But this idea of in special operations, they are empowered because people make it through that process because they're critical thinkers. They're creative. They solve problems on the fly in very extreme circumstances. So you take that and you look at that. Well, what are we asking of our best employees? We're asking them to make good decisions, solve problems on the fly, pivot and adjust as necessary. It's not this old, kind of industrialization model of like, I'm building a car. You need to put, 5 screws here. Don't worry about the rest of it. Just do that as fast as you can, as many times a day. Right. And that doesn't unlock that person's capabilities in any form or fashion. We're just trying to be efficient. And a lot of the old command control, approaches are trying to create efficiency. And when they don't realize is that when you're trying to build organizations that are nimble, that can adapt to massive change and competitive pressure, you need an environment that's agile and that is based on critical thinking and problem solving, which means you got to be focusing on empowerment. So control and command might give you quality control or a sense that you can make adjustments easier, but you're actually disempowering your entire organization potentially. And so you even saw this in, there's great stories about like how Steve Jobs would make sure to close that gap that we were talking about between, leadership and the customer. He would go sit in cafes. I remember this, having grown up in Silicon Valley myself, going to a Pete's Coffee and seeing Steve Jobs in the corner. He would notoriously go to stores and watch people use products, see how they were interacting with technology. And there's so many little stories of just people who grow up around all of that, watching that take place because he was always curious. He really cared how people looked and interacted with technology, not just Apple's technology, but broadly speaking. And so you see that shift in the most successful companies. Same thing with Google. I mean, they're another great example. They really focus on how Google works. And they're like, if every leader is saying that people are their most important asset, then why are we not empowering them to be the most creative problem solvers and to be the most effective as we possibly can?
Yeah. And I think something you touched on there sort of opened a door to another bucket in this misalignment category that I think is really interesting. And I think it's something that maybe a lot of leaders don't think about, but the idea is that you're overlooking the cost of siloed knowledge, right? So as we're talking about empowerment or disempowerment, if you bring in all these brilliant people to work in an organization, yet you keep each one of them focused on their own task versus this, free flow of information, you really are locking up that information. I wonder if you'd talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, siloing can just happen naturally. It's not by intention, but I think it's really important that their leadership is always working to break down those silos. And I think that's where, in interviewing people for the book, it was interesting, everything from a company at the scale of Microsoft to a startup is dealing with some level of siloed knowledge where it's going to institutionalize either within an individual or a larger group. And what's really important is that you have cross-functional collaboration and you really make sure that these teams have a common language. So, and that's really where the breakdown tends to happen, is that there's no common language and shared understanding of that language. So this happens all the time between designers and engineers, right? One's really focused on what the experience of the product is, and the engineers are really focused on developing the features and functionality of that product. They're both critical to the problem-solving process. They should be collaborating at both ends of the process, and they rarely are. They're kind of organized into these, kind of autonomous little silos, and then it becomes very, very kind of traditional, kind of almost production oriented. But you see great high-performing teams. They've torn down those silos. They create iterative, very fast-moving cycles of collaboration to keep those walls down and those silos not to allow to be rebuilt. And then the most successful that at scale, those companies, what they're doing is they're really focused on knowledge management. So not skipping the steps where those silos start to build up, because now only a certain key people have access to that information that's essential. And so we see a lot of companies actually lose what I would call the ownership of their product, because if they were ever asked to reconstruct it, it wouldn't be possible.
So as we've been talking, this subject of alignment and the silos and everything, I've in the back of my head the whole time I've been thinking about harmonic frequency. I don't know if you know much about audio or how it works, but you ever see that if you have two tuning forks that are tuned to G, you can have one on the far side of the room and one sitting with you, and you hit the tuning fork, and the other tuning fork that's on the same frequency as that G is going to be ringing as well. The same thing goes with the piano. So if you're playing the piano and you hit the sustain pedal and you really hit on middle C, every single C on the scale is going to start playing. And that kind of made me think of the silo thing. So the way a piano works is they have dampening pedals on each string, and those dampening hammers or whatever they are will actually prevent the strings from making noise if you're not intending for it to make noise. When you hold the sustain pedal, it lifts all those hammers up, and then you can hit that middle C, and every single middle C or C across the spectrum will start playing along with it. And it's harmonic frequencies. And I think it's kind of similar, whereas if you tell someone, hey, this is what we need, but developers over here, and he's playing in a different note, once you get them in tune, they're going to play together very well. And it's the same thing, but it kept popping up in my head. I'm like, this is a good analogy. Figured I would share. So
it's a perfect analogy. I mean, I admittedly don't know a ton about, harmonics, but I mean, it completely, no pun intended, resonates, when you think about it that way.
Yeah.
So the next category in your book is more focused on the leadership and developing an attitude of alignment from the top down. And I wonder, we touched on this stuff a little bit, but I wonder if you can talk about this maybe in a little bit more depth, meaning, so as a leader, most leaders come to the table with some sort of set of skills and things like that. But to assume that all leaders are going to be cut out equally and be capable of doing this kind of leadership, I think is maybe naive. And so I wonder, if you're a leader and you're trying to improve yourself, how can you start to shift your mindset? We talked earlier about inherent bias and that we're sort of, driven to just confirm our own beliefs. Like, how can we just break out of that thing altogether? And, I think you've got a million leaders out there that would say, oh yeah, no, I'm open to ideas. I want to hear from everybody. But when it comes down to matter of fact, a lot of times they're open to everybody as long as their idea resonates with their already pre-established fact pattern. And so I wonder if you couldn't maybe just dig in on that a little bit. And again, just maybe a little more on how do we fight nature?
Yeah, I think one key thing is, so from a product leadership perspective, and I would say from a C-suite level of leadership today, for any organization that's going to be driving product transformation, whether it's internal or external, leaders today have to understand that there are different skills that they're going to have to develop. So let's assume, for our sake of our conversation, that leaders agree that they have to address confirmation bias, that they have to understand that there is an essential need to empower their teams and move away from this old command and control model. Well, then they also need to be trilingual. And what I mean by that is they have to have a business acumen, but they have to have a commanding understanding of design thinking, creativity, and they have to have a commanding understanding of technology and what it takes to actually develop and engineer a great product. And if you're missing one of those three legs of the stool, so to speak, you're going to have challenges. And so then you need to make sure, are you aware enough of your own deficits where you can actually make sure you put the right people in place in your organization to hold that up? And then are they empowered to drive the decision? And are you willing to step back and realize that they are more of an expert in that area than you are? So that becomes a really key thing of like, how do leaders build up their competency? And it really has to start with that. And that's just not a competency that we've been asking of our leaders up until recently. But you see it when you go out there. And I ran into this. I mean, thousands of hours of research went into the book, and so many conversations I can't even count. But there was this constant theme. Every single successful leader that had not just, there weren't any one-hit wonders here. These were people who had continuously driven success in their careers across multiple organizations over decades. And, that requires this trilingual skill set that they all had. And they all had it in different ways. Some were more technical savvy than others, but they had still invested into understanding that other side. And what it allowed them to do was build more cohesive teams, to understand and set more realistic expectations. It allowed them as leaders to assign resources appropriately that would effectively solve the problem they were trying to solve. And that knowledge allowed them to manage a more successful business at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And also, just speaking of competencies, it occurs to me. So, really from the beginning of this conversation, we've been talking about strategy and how important strategy is, and that we need to keep checking with our strategy or our why, right? Why are we doing this? What's our strategy here? But I wonder, there seems to be some, ambiguation between the terms planning and strategy. I think a lot of people mistake planning for strategy and vice versa. And I think so a lot of times they think they're being strategic, but what they're really doing is planning. And so I wonder if you could talk just for a moment about sort of the difference between the two things. And maybe this goes back to that idea of competency as leaders. If you've got a leader whose preset definition of strategy is actually planning, then, they may not be equipped to make great strategic decisions, because they just simply don't understand, don't know what they don't know.
So, I mean, it's a funny thing. I mean, I run into it almost every day, to be honest. And I do this also when working with entire leadership teams. So planning is often mistaken as strategy would be things like, what's our schedule? What's our budget? What are our goals? And it's like, well, we want to increase, sales of our product 10% month over month for the next, 6 quarters. That's our strategy. Well, that's not a strategy at all. I mean, that's a set of goals. And then they build out this beautiful little chart that shows how they're going to grow the company exponentially over the next 6 quarters. And they come up with a schedule of what they're going to do. And essentially, then it falls flat. And that's the reality that most organizations are dealing with because they've mistaken, that planning for that strategy. But what it does, which is really interesting, is in having these conversations of why that happens so often, what we would run into more often than not is people are looking for a sense of security, something that they can control. So they're looking for that resources that like, oh, this will be done by this date. Well, what is it actually? But you haven't solved the problem. What will it actually take to sell 10% more of your product each quarter? What has to happen? Does a change in your core customer have to take place? Do you have to change your messaging and your marketing? Is your product creating enough value that people are willing to pay for it? Are you going to increase the price? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to get to 10%. There's also, maybe it's not acquiring new customers. Maybe your actual problem you need to solve to grow the company is client retention, and you need to increase lifetime customer value. And maybe that's not happening, not because the product's not good, but you didn't do a good job onboarding them to understand the value of the product and how successfully it can solve their problem. And so what strategy is really doing is it's saying, okay, we want to be here in the future. We want to grow our company 10% quarter over quarter. That's great. But what does that look like? What's the destination clearly look like? And then what do we have to do to get there? And is that sustainable? Can we actually maintain that to build the relevance of our company as we go forward in a sustainable way? So strategy is really focusing on this anchor of understanding the problem in space, understanding then the approach that you're going to take to solve that problem, and then balancing that with the limited time and resources you have in a constructive way. And if you have that clarity, then everybody can start marching towards, helping accomplish that vision. But a plan doesn't do any of that. A schedule doesn't tell you what problems to solve. A schedule and a plan, a set of goals doesn't tell you anything about what approach to take. It's just a bunch of information that, if it's not grounded by strategy, will be thrown away.
Yeah, no, I love that. And in your book, you have a good quote that I think sums that up nicely from Jim Gochi, a former CPO over at New Relic. It says, a good and simple definition of a strategy is a way to get from where you are today to where you want to go. First, you have to know where you're trying to go. What's your North Star? What success will look like? Then pick your time period. Is it 5 years, something else? To win the game, you have to start by defining the game you're playing. And I think that that's a really great way of looking at it. I often use the metaphor of like a roadmap, right? If you're trying to get Los Angeles to New York, right? I mean, there's such a thing as a straight line. Maybe that's your flight, right? But largely, you're going to wind and weave, across the country to get to where you're going. And there isn't a set way. There's lots of ways to get to New York, right? And to be adaptable and if you hit a roadblock, to be able to go around and that sort of thing, I think is really critical. But if everything we're doing is contributing to that path to New York, and we're trying to land in New York City one way or another, then, I think if you draw that conclusion or draw that metaphor to, our product design, for example, if our product is to arrive at X so that we can solve problem Y, well, then, we need to start solving problems along that route. How do we get from A to B? So I love those as metaphors.
Well, and another
that's
thing,
a great metaphor.
Along that same metaphor, checking the North Star to make sure you're still on track. You look at the sailors back in the day, they would check multiple times a day just to make sure they're still heading in the right direction. Because even if you're off by 1 degree, at the end result, that could be 400 or 500 miles off. And we've all heard this analogy before, but I think it's important that you step back and keep checking to make sure you're heading in the right direction. Really critical. So
absolutely. I mean, I think you're hitting on something that is also one of those challenges that I think a lot of leadership and management teams suffer from, which they look at strategy as kind of this, we'll do it once and then we'll just get to work. But they aren't checking on that regular basis like you talked about. And strategy really needs to be episodic. It needs to be something you're doing all the time. And the faster your organization is moving and innovating, the faster the market is that you're in, then the more often you should be checking that strategy, because it is that, going to be that anchor to being successful and making really smart decisions through that process that are grounded in continuously moving the entire organization forward.
Yeah, what I like too about that idea of the North Star or, New York City or whatever it is this idea of sort of consistency, right? We have to keep checking back with ourselves because we're going to this object. Now, I mean, maybe if you're plotting space travel or something and it's, we're trying to talk technology, so technology might be a little bit of a moving target. You have to do some calculations to figure out how to arrive at, Cape Canaveral when the world is spinning at, whatever rate. But largely speaking, your target should be more or less fixed. I mean, maybe new learnings will say, okay, well, we don't actually need New York City. Really, we need to get to the Bronx. So it's not just, getting to New York, it's actually getting to the Bronx, or maybe things move around a little bit. But generally speaking, I think having sort of a fixed point, like a North Star, for example, and then continually checking against that, like Mike said, I think is probably, a great way of looking at this.
Yeah. Well, and you can just look into history. I mean, since you brought up the, space travel analogy, I mean, it's a perfect one. So, the space program, when Kennedy said, we're going to go to put a man on the moon, they didn't just all of a sudden plan the moon mission, right? I mean, they started developing and creating incrementally the technologies and the science to make that possible. And so, first, orbiting the Earth and then figuring out how to safely bring people back. And then how are we going to make that journey to the moon? And, and then how are we eventually going to land? I mean, there was all of these incremental steps that required innovation, problem solving, and critical thinking. And so that's the other thing that I think is so often can happen with planning and being misunderstood as strategy is they create these lofty goals or these big picture things, but they don't then break the problem they're solving down into these incremental, digestible challenges that the team is actually empowered and capable of delivering on, and in what order those need to happen in order for them to land on the moon.
Well, one of the things that,
and that's a critical piece.
In the actual lunar landing, little bit of knowledge here or whatever, they didn't know how deep the sand was on top. So they didn't know if they're going to land on the moon, if they're just going to sink down and then not be able to take off again. So when they actually designed the landing gear for the lunar module or whatever it came down, they actually put like 3 foot wide planks on the bottom of the feet so that they could land and be secure, knowing that they're not going to sink into the sand. And actually Neil Armstrong, when he took the first step off, the famous quote, "One small step for mankind," whatever, the next thing he started talking about was the soil structure and what it was. That's one thing they were really scared about. And when they got there, they were able to define what it was and actually that they could actually take off again. So, I mean, just the amount of checks and rechecks and little things that they had to do to get there, it shows. It's a perfect analogy for this. So anyways.
Yeah, and I really like that as a metaphor for just being able to adapt to change. Like, I think that that's a really smart thing because, ultimately, we want to drive to New York, but I don't know, maybe the tunnel's closed right now. Right. Like, I don't know. I won't know until I get there, So
yeah,
when I get there, I'll find out I can't go through there and I have to go around. Right. So it's good to plan. Right. Okay, maybe I packed a lunch because I'm going to be stuck in traffic for an hour. But, so prepare for the worst, I guess, and hope for the best, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I love that. And, there are problems out there that they just, we're going to make our best educated guess. I mean, I didn't know about the landing. I think that's absolutely fantastic, but it is such a great, metaphor for, why strategy is so important. There's a quote actually in the book from Jeff Bezos. He says, "We're stubborn on vision and we're flexible, on planning." So it's, they understand plans are meant to adapt. But this idea of certainty gets in the way a lot. And you see this even in smaller initiatives where we need to plan for this certainty. And then all of a sudden, one of the other areas of failure that are early on in the book when we talk about failure is expectations management. So that's the dangerous thing about planning without all of the right information, is that you are, you don't have a realistic understanding or a set of expectations to align to the situation. Whereas, using the lunar landing as the example, right? They didn't know, but they understood they were taking that risk, right? That was a big risk until they actually landed.
Yeah.
But organizations that are so risk adverse will push planning ahead of actually understanding what it's going to take to solve the problem, or even the scope of the problem to begin with.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. So as we get to sort of the end of the book and the end of this interview, as we're getting into the last 10 or 15 minutes here, your book sort of transitions or takes a little bit of a shift into more of this straight up team alignment, right? We've worked on all these foundational things. We've got our foundations in line. We've figured out some strategies for leading teams. Now we actually need to pull it all together. So can you talk a little bit about how that works and how we start to create sort of a collaborative versus just coordinated environment for our teams?
Absolutely. So one of the big benefits of aligned teams that you see is they are more outcome focused than they are deliverable focused. And so they're really focused on what's the next outcome that we have to achieve. And by doing that, they're really aligned to the bigger picture and how their work fits into the strategy at the team level and down to the task level, which is really important. So it's why there was an entire section of the book really dedicated to this. How do we develop the collaboration and the environment for teams to thrive? And, it touches on all of the things that we've been talking about, like clarity, building a common language, understanding, how to work together to actually accelerate delivering those outcomes. But it brings it together at a team specific level. So something that seems so fundamental to so many, but is often missing, or as simple as saying, okay, in this product team, what are the roles and responsibilities? And if those roles and responsibilities are being successfully, fulfilled, then what's the outcome of that success? Instead of, it's okay if we check all this long laundry list of responsibilities, but more importantly is, what's the outcome? Like, what is the head of design really, what's the outcome of their job being done successfully look like? That really gives them clarity, but more importantly, it gives the entire team clarity of how their contribution will impact the success of their work. And so that transparency of understanding roles and responsibilities and outcomes becomes essential if you want to build a high performance team that's aligned and you want to accelerate that process. And when we think about trying to be, efficient with how we spend our time and our money, and, how we work with one another to solve problems, that's an essential foundation that allows us to accelerate. And then we can start to move faster and faster and faster. And I'll go back to the kind of the band analogy, right? All of a sudden, when you get into, sync with a group, you can actually, when you're jamming how, that you can play off of each other, and interpret what people are going to do. You can anticipate things. And that allows you to solve problems, avoid them quicker, collaborate, making sure you're on the same page. And teams are constantly dealing with these issues of, oh, I didn't understand it that way, so sorry, I was working on the wrong thing. Or, hey, I didn't, think of it that way. I had a different perspective. And so we're going to have to rework that. And those things cost real time, real money that have huge impacts on organizations. And so we're like, let's just call it what it is. And let's get that out there. And these teams are not being set up with alignment in place. And let's focus on those things going forward. And then let's make sure that they understand it at a detail level, what they need to be looking at within their product to maintain that alignment as they move forward at all four levels.
Yeah, and I love too, like in this section of the book, so we moved from back in misalignment, we talked a little bit about siloing of knowledge. But by the time we get to this category, like a real indicator that things are gelling and that we're actually aligned is this collective competence, right? It's that ability to bounce off one another, like you're talking about. And I love that band metaphor for that. Both Mike and I have worked with a lot of musical acts over the years, and I think have some firsthand experience where we could say, yeah, obviously it's that way. You've got a drummer that can just, pound out a rhythm, or somebody can play a quick riff, and somebody can start writing a lyric or whatever to all this stuff. And, they didn't need some, top level executive at the record label to come tell them that this is what you need to do. Rather, they are all leaning on their knowledge of themselves and one another to align to this mission of let's create a new song, or let's write a new album, or whatever it is. And in the product space, it's the same thing, right? How do we achieve this objective? But we've developed, through the course of implementation of great company culture, strong leadership, and sort of a reliance on one another, a true team mentality that allows us to sort of lean on one another, understand our own personal strengths, but have a deep enough understanding of each other's strengths that we can actually rely on one another.
So, Ryan, I was actually in the room with Mink Rebellion when they wrote Bump on the Head, and when they were in the process of writing the song. And it was really quite cool to see, as an outsider, not a member of the band, just the process that they went through developing that song. They had a little riff. Bass player's like, oh, that's kind of cool, let's try this. All of a sudden drummer's kicking in, and then Bobby's sitting here writing lyrics. And after an hour and a half of just messing around, now they've got kind of the core concept of the song. They play it through, and then they go and change a few things here and there, and then all of a sudden they have a completed nice song. And of course, over time, it's going to change a little bit. And then when they go into the studio, it's a whole nother process, because, usually when you're in the studio, you do a scratch track and you get everything kind of dialed out. Then you go and you perfect each individual part. And sometimes bands don't like that very much. When you isolate them out, it's hard for, the bass player to be in a separate room and the drummer to be in a separate room and try and track everything at the same time. Usually they all like being in the same place, and it comes together. So it's a very good analogy. And I just, as someone who's been through this process and had firsthand experiences with a band writing a song, it's really cool to hear that analogy and actually have experience with it.
Well, and I think that there's an aspect of that too that I'd like to just sort of call out, because I think it's, maybe something that a team could take away from this, is that willingness to sort of try and fail. Right. So these guys in the band, I mean, they're going to try this riff. If that riff doesn't work, okay, we'll try this one, or this bass line, or that drum, that beat pattern, or, whatever it is. Right. And in the product space, maybe it's, this button placement, or this, methodology for running this, form through, through post, or, whatever it is they're going to try and do. But you've got to be willing to just sort of try stuff. And I think in some cultures that aren't maybe, as strong as people might hope for, there isn't a culture where you can sort of swing and miss a little bit, and you can sort of, work on something collaborative and find a new and unique or novel way of solving a problem. And I think the companies who have that culture are probably more agile, more capable of producing, good quality things quickly, because they're not getting hung up on perfection at every step of the way. Now they'll do a good job. They'll be competent, as you're a professional and you grow and you get better, you do that kind of thing. But I think that there's really something to this idea of sort of iterative trying, and being, I guess, sort of allowed to do that, or having a culture in your organization that allows that to take place.
Yeah, no, it's really huge. I mean, we see it all the time as, collaboration is really unlocked through alignment, which is a result of trust in the organization and the culture that you're talking about, right? It's like, if I have a trusted environment where I know I'm safe to experiment, to fail, and then it's kind of that, if you're co-creating with somebody or a large group, if you can do that in the most smallest incremental ways, where in a very safe way, failure is encouraged because you're learning constantly, then that's really successful. And, the organizations that can embrace that, thrive with that kind of environment. It's always the flip side is, we've also seen it in our work, where it's really dangerous when, let's say, management adopts this fail fast, fail often mentality without understanding what it really means. Yeah. And so, as you guys are talking about it, like, you're nailing the spirit of what that is all about, but it's so often misinterpreted, or like, we need to be agile. Like, well, what does agile mean to you? And it is that collaborative, process, an iterative process that has to take place, but they have to create an environment. They have to empower their people to be able to do that work so they feel safe. So if they fail, there's not a risk that comes with that. There's an opportunity.
Well, and I imagine too that there's this aspect, you mentioned trust. When you're a young band working in your garage, and you're trying to get something together, I mean, maybe it takes some time to write a song, right? I mean, maybe you're not that proficient at this craft yet, and you're trying to figure out how to craft music that will work and draw the attention of the public or whatever. But by the time you're an Aerosmith or a Rolling Stones, you're so proficient at this that, the ability to sit down and crank out a song when literally every sound that your device could make, I think, can be sort of a parallel in your organization. Might just have to do with, how professional are your team? How good are these people? That sort of things. And then your fail fast, fail often thing. It's good to have the latitude to be able to do that. But if you're a great professional and you've, engineered thousands of apps or different software solutions or whatever it is, I mean, you probably have got the competence to be able to think, agilely, in that you're able to sort of move and adapt to whatever the change is, but you have such a deep knowledge of the technology or the space or whatever it is, that you're very capable of making those changes without failing too often. And so I think that,
Absolutely.
Proficiency and sort of time served is a big part of this too.
So I can't,
that's a huge piece.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that issue of just, you take a group like the Rolling Stones. I mean, it's unconscious competency, right? They're so competent in what they do. They've gone from mastery of those skills to that unconscious competence. It's just part of how they work and how they, operate. And you see that in organizations, like you're saying, and it's really amazing to see that in a team dynamic, though, right? Even in a great band, if you have one person who isn't at that level, then you've got the whole team has to move down to the level of that individual so they can help them elevate and create together. And that's sometimes where you see misalignment happen as well, is you've got this really amazing level of competency in one area, but it's being pulled down by another, or and that competency is not being reoriented to help lift up the other group. Right. So then all of a sudden they're living in conflict. And so if that's recognized, when we think about like leadership roles, they can really set up a situation where both teams can be elevated because of that.
So I can't remember the name of the band, but I remember what they did. In mid-90s band, huge charting, like a U2 level band, but I don't think it was U2. But they had been recording and putting out albums and touring for a long, long time, and no radio success, no major success based off of it. And they kind of got stuck in this rut. And as they were in the writing process for the next album, they made this conscious decision that everyone in the band is going to step back, and we're actually going to change our instruments. We're going to play different instruments. So the lead guitarist, he's like, I was playing 8 hours a day my entire life on a guitar, and I was just getting sick of it. And the drummer switched to playing bass, and the lead singer switched to playing drums and this and that. And by switching that up and making it where they, were vulnerable again, and they weren't so proficient in their, instrument of choice or whatever they're doing, they actually wrote one of the album that took them to the radio and was so successful for 3 or 4 weeks. I just heard this like 3 or 4 days ago, and it didn't stick in my brain, but I just thought that was really cool that I'm going to take a step out of my comfort zone, get vulnerable with you guys again, and write this amazing album on an instrument that I don't even normally play. It's kind of, I just think it's neat that something like that can influence your creativity to kind of do what you need to do to get out of the rut. So I don't know why.
And I think that's exactly what Jonathon was talking about, though. I mean, it's this idea that the others can sort of elevate you, right? Like, you're a competent guitar player, and now all of a sudden you're playing bass. It would behoove you to get good at it and learn some new skills and get, leveled up so that you can participate, at the same level that you're used to playing. So just like Jonathon was saying before, you maybe bring on a new teammate that's not, totally up to speed or doesn't understand everything as well as you might. Well, that's your opportunity to train and excel and work harder and lift yourself, right? So this is how we can come back into alignment. So I think that's a great metaphor. So Jonathon, here we are at the end of this thing. Can we, do you mind sharing with the audience where they can learn more about you, can get a hold of the book, that sort of thing?
Sure. So if they're interested in learning more about myself and the work that I do, they can visit the website emergeinteractive.com. Which is the company that I own with my business partner, and where there's a ton of resources for people interested in developing their own products and services there. And then the book is available on Amazon as well as in iTunes. And please check it out. It's a great resource for anybody who's looking to level up.
Yeah. Once again, the book is called Alignment: Overcoming Internal Sabotage and Digital Product Failure. Looks like this. So check it out on Amazon and everywhere fine books are found. Mike, any parting shots?
No, just thanks for reaching out and thinking of us. Really appreciate it. So
thanks for having me back on the show, guys. It was really fantastic to be able to chat with you again.
Yep.
Absolutely. Great to do it. And thanks to everybody who tunes in this week and every week, and we'll see you all next time.